this is Brave New History. We're here with Rabbi Tovia Singer. He, a rabbi that reaches out to missionaries, right, and Jews maybe thinking about converting to Christianity. That's a fair description?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I help Jewish people who are in the church considering converting to Christianity, help them return back to the Jewish faith. And moreover, Christians who are engaged in evangelizing Jews level some very serious charges against the Jewish faith. They're questions that deserve to be answered. And I devote my life to addressing those important questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks so much for coming. And so what are your thoughts on Christian origins? Do you think it really came from Judaism, or is it more like a Greek invention? Or what do you suppose is going on?
Well, Christianity is the most highly variegated religion in the world. So many expressions of the Christian religion where they disagree on fundamental doctrines. Moreover, if you think that the Christianity that we observe today is diverse, in the ancient world, in the early church, it was even more diverse. So there were expressions of Christianity which did not survive. Ebionites, Nazarenes, the church fathers tell us about that. Their writings don't survive. But largely, what you have are pagan ideas that are using or misappropriating Jewish symbols, vague concepts. So in Christians talk, of course, the central figure in Christianity is Jesus, who it is claimed is the Messiah. So that's a Jewish term, Mashiach. That's a completely Jewish term, but there's no relationship between what the Hebrew Bible says about the Messiah and what Christians say about Jesus. The Messiah is not supposed to die. In fact, much of the New Testament addresses the conundrum of why didn't Jesus do anything that anyone expected? He's not supposed to die for anybody's sins. Rather, he's going to teach the world, transform the world. But in the Christian view, he's one of the many deities in their view of a triune Godhead that acts as an intermediary between God and man. In fact, Paul sums that up in 1 Timothy 2:5. There is God, and there's man, and there's one mediator between the two, and that's Jesus Christ. So he's a kind of a God man who is able to intervene in a theological scheme where the Father is essentially inaccessible. The Father is just so amazingly righteous, and he's so up there that who could speak to the creator of the planets? This is where the Greco-Roman world thought. Zeus was inaccessible. Jupiter was inaccessible, and people didn't pray to them. They were too busy. But you had these lower tier gods, and that's where Jesus falls in the henotheistic, Neoplatonic religion that simply took the ideas that were well known beyond the Greco-Roman world in North Africa, and then interpolate them into a faint Jewish sketch using Jewish symbols, Jewish terms, and that's the religion that became so successful throughout the empire.
Yeah. Now, do you suppose it came from like maybe less than orthodox forms of Judaism, like with Philo, and maybe the part in Proverbs where they talk about the wisdom of God and identify it as a female figure and kind of coexisting with God? You think that's maybe the genesis a bit?
Yes, very much so. So it's very important for your viewers to understand that Philo wasn't just less orthodox. Less, I mean, that's like saying that astrology is a little less orthodox than astronomy. It's not
Yeah.
only less orthodox, it's off the charts. It has nothing to do with Judaism. Philo, his name was Chaim, was born in the year 20 BCE. He died in the 50s. So he lived right through the whole Christian period. He was a contemporary. Of course, he didn't write a word about Jesus, but Philo's idea of the Logos, a transcendent deity that was not the ultimate great God, but it was a demiurge. It was kind of the god of the physical world that was in between. That's all Neoplatonic ideas, and these were not crazy people. They were completely logical. And we live in the modern. We know so much. We know that everything we encounter is made up of the same elements, of the same stuff. That you and your dog share 98% of your DNA in common. The ancient world, they didn't understand any of these things. So they saw the planets and were amazed by the perfection of the symmetry and their movements and their predictability. And then they looked around them and they saw death. Imagine a world where there's no modern medicine. Would you be alive today if
Hmm.
modern medicine, antibiotics didn't exist? Many people would say I'd probably be dead by now, right? So people just died suddenly, inexplicably. This world seemed to be a broken place, a place that was inexplicably damaged. There was no explanation for it, and therefore there was thought that there's the great deity that governs the celestial bodies, and then there's this lesser god or this terrestrial deity that governed this world. That was very much the Neoplatonic view. They were just completely incompatible, and they were really rational actors. They were not. The only thing is, it wasn't Jewish. The Jewish idea was so radical, was so outrageous to the ancient world that there's one God, and He governs everything, and everything is from Him, and you can talk to Him. He loves you, and He just wants a relationship with you. That was outrageous to the ancient world. The Greco in both in the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire, Jews were respected for a variety of reasons, but they couldn't wrap their head around this. Like the eternal God, which they all believed in, can talk to you, would once that was just they couldn't imagine such an idea. So yeah, this is all Neoplatonic. The idea that comes into view in John chapter 1, the prologue from verse 1 through 18. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. All that is all uh, Philo of Alexandria. There's a Jewish saying which I invented, but could anything good come from Alexandria? So every iteration of idolatry, all the way through the doctrine of the Trinity, was all emerged from North Africa. The thinkers who were the interlocutors at the Council of Nicaea were all from Alexandria. Its bishop, its deacon, they were all the people who advocated for the doctrine of the Trinity. So the Philo, who visited Israel frequently, his ideas were the ideas that had such a persuasive effect on the way early Christians thought.
Yeah. So do you find it as like, where did Philo, do you think, get the idea? Is it just Hellenized Judaism just kind of goes off the rails a bit? Or
No, I think Philo was affected not by Judaism. Philo was persuaded by the thinking of his time. Again, it's this Neoplatonic thinking. It's a dualism as well, that comes all the way from Persia, and the Greeks import it and regurgitate it in a refined way. So no, so Philo didn't invent anything. He borrowed everything, refined it brilliantly, understandably, again, in the ancient world. How would you so Philo was not orthodox. Not only he was so not orthodox, it would be like, Karl Marx is genetically Jewish. He was born to a Jewish family, right? But it would be impossible to argue that Karl Marx's ideas had anything to do with Judaism. He was a fierce enemy of Orthodox Judaism. So Philo's ideas had nothing to do with Judaism. Judaism is always insisting that there's one God, there's nothing else. It's the same creator of everything. Everything emerges from that God. And moreover, that God is not transcendent. That God is not distant. That he will interact with you. He's listening to you, which we really can't wrap our minds around that. No, we can understand what it means to have compassion, but not on every person. Like, how could he worry about your problems, Elliot, and the woman in Bangkok whose husband just beat her and she's crying? Like, he's paying attention to everyone and running the planets. That's just in we just it's inconceivable. That's the message of Judaism, that it's a complete, absolute monotheism. And if your viewers should know this, in the ancient world, that was the only monotheism. That was the only game in town. I mean, if you wanted to believe in one God, there was only Judaism. There was no competition. Nobody else believed in one God in the ancient world.
Yeah. So do you think Paul do you think he was actually a Pharisee?
No,
Since his yeah, he just
no, right.
yeah,
So,
what's going on there?
right. So, the term Pharisee is an anachronism, and it just means an Orthodox Jew. The term Orthodox Jew was just coined a couple of centuries ago by a it's just a new, but there are the same thing. So just like today, if you want to talk about Jews who are very serious, you talk about Orthodox Jews, right? And no matter where you're coming from, whether you believe in it or don't believe it, you oppose it, you like it, you're whatever it is, but the Orthodox Jew, that's the gold standard. So that's what the Pharisees are. Paul's ideas emerge out of the Greco-Roman world, are Neoplatonic. The Paul's idea of the rapture in First Thessalonians chapter 4, the idea that the believers are all sucked into the heavens, and God deals judgment on this earth. More importantly, his notion of the resurrection of the dead in 1 Corinthians 15, probably his most famous chapter, in where he states unambiguously that Jesus rose from the dead. Of course, he's the first fruits of the resurrection for sure, but whatever resurrected is not the mortal body that died. It's something new and spiritual. There's a resurrection. That's what the Greeks thought. The Jews didn't think that at all. They believe and to this day, it's a core tenet of our faith, of a physical resurrection from the dead. Now, you may think, well, this seems trivial. That was the big thing that the ancient world could not get. The Greeks and the Romans just could not understand why Jews would ever want to return back to the wretched body. Remember how they thought about it? So they all believed in an afterlife, but it was a spiritual afterlife. So that goes right through 1 Corinthians 15. It's almost certainly the reason why Paul never mentions an empty tomb. He never mentions an empty tomb because Jesus could have resurrected without the tomb being empty. Because what resurrects is not the corpse. So
Mhm.
this is an interesting area. So Paul leaves out the empty tomb, but the empty tomb is very prominent in the Gospels. Paul's letters date to the 50s. The Gospels are written between 70 and 95, right? So it's a considerable amount of time later. In the ancient world, 30, 40, 50 years was an enormous amount of time. People generally didn't even live that long. So the church on that one issue is going to turn the corner and return back to Judaism on that and say, no, Jesus really was a physical resurrection. That's going to be advanced by the Gospels, especially in Luke 24, especially at the end of John, where Thomas is touching the flesh of Jesus. They're pushing back. That's an apologetic. So Paul's ideas are utterly comfortable in Tarsus, a place of Western philosophical reflection, not Jerusalem at all. Paul claiming to be a Pharisee is the claim you would need to make if you wanted any credibility at all. That was the standard. Like it, in the New Testament, which is hostile to Jews. New Testament characterizes the Jews unfavorably. Those who are not Christians, they don't come off well. And nevertheless, the Christian Bible says the Pharisees and scribes sit in the seat of Moses, right? The oracles of God were given to the Jews, Romans chapter 3. So the unless your righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees, you can't enter heaven. That's the Sermon of the Mount. So that's the gold standard. So Paul is going to be advancing repeatedly why his authority is greater than others. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees from the tribe of Benjamin. He has it directly from Jesus Christ. He didn't get it anything from Jerusalem. This is what the first two chapters of Galatians are about, Philippians 3. Paul is always advancing his credentials against who? Fellow Christians who disagreed with his views. So Paul was always saying that, look, I come from a Pharisaic background. There was no one who was more zealous for the Lord than me. Basically, he is saying I'm the smartest guy in the class. Paul doesn't claim to be a student of Gamaliel in his own letters.
Mhm.
Book of Acts makes that claim. That would have been outrageous. Paul could never pull that off in his own writings because Gamaliel would have been alive at the time. That would be very easy to check. So Paul is claiming to be a Pharisee, but there's no relationship with what he teaches and Pharisaic ideas, let alone writing in Greek. Uh, Paul persecuting Christians, that would have been a very strange thing to do. In fact, in the book of Acts, Gamaliel says,
Mhm.
don't persecute Christians, let alone what authority would Paul have had over Christians in Damascus. The whole story doesn't make sense. So, no, Paul was not a Pharisee. He was like today, people who are not Jewish or not Orthodox know a lot about Judaism, know a lot about Orthodox Jews, right? We were we are were very we were a group whose influence was considerable given our small numbers. But Judaism is a very, very important religion, and therefore people were very familiar with Jewish texts. So Paul was no Pharisee.
Yeah. So you'd say he's fibbing, that
Oh yeah,
maybe Mithraism, yeah, because that.
he was just
'Cause-
very Greek. The language he wrote in, maybe a point for the viewers. So Greek wasn't just like another language. It's not like today someone writes in Spanish or Portuguese. That wouldn't mean anything. What does that convey? Nothing. Greek was the enemy culture to the Jews. The story of Hanukkah had just occurred 2 centuries earlier, not even 2 centuries earlier. So Greek thought, influence, power was all antithetical to religious Jews. Religious Jews saw anything Greek as the enemy, opposing that. There was enormous tension. It was very important to Jews not to do anything Greek. All the grotesque behavior, theater, theater was invented in the city-state of Athens 2,500 years ago. All of that was, to the Jew, was seen as a a threat to Judaism. Religious Jews didn't write in Greek. They spoke in Aramaic. They would have written in Aramaic, would have written in Hebrew, but Greek was immediately a red flag for something very dangerous. People who had ideas that were thoroughly opposed by the Hebrew Bible. So don't think of Greek as just another language or the lingua franca of the time. Because you have to transport yourself to the Jewish world, to the Jewish mind. Greek was the enemy philosophy, idea, everything Greek was very bad for Jewish people.
Yeah. So you suppose, like, so we have like Judaism, and then we have Greek thought,
Hmm.
and we have Christianity with the Greek thought, and then it claims origins from Judaism. Although it's clear that they're different things, right? You think that's where the whole anti-Semitism comes from, or Gnosticism, is kind of the self-realization?
Okay, so the anti-Semitism comes directly from the Christian Bible, because the Christian Bible is just extremely hostile to Jews. And there may be someone watching me right now who thinks maybe this rabbi just has an unfavorable view of Christianity, and I'm characterizing it in a way that's uncharitable. Well, if anyone just opens up the Gospels, which are stories, so stories, not like Paul Wood's theology, the Jews are in almost every story, and the Jews are doing just the worst possible thing in the world. And not only that, it's not just the Jews are wrong in the Gospels, the Jews are the enemies of God, and they're called the children of the devil in John 8:44. And while Gentiles may not get it, Pontius Pilate was perhaps flawed. He and his wife in Matthew 27 correctly recognized Jesus completely innocent, while the Jews are screaming, "Crucify him," and we take his blood upon ourselves and our children. Oh,
Yeah.
every single story, it will be the kind of thing you would read in in pamphlets published by the Klan about Jews, that the Jews control everything. That's where it all comes from.
Oh,
The
oh,
Jews
yeah,
control the
yeah.
world, we control Hollywood, we control the media, we control chess. For some reason, Jews do very well in chess. We do very well in the Jews just control that whole idea that Jews are a pernicious, demonic people who control the world, who have power far exceeding their numbers. There must be some conspiracy. The Jews are the enemy. It's not that the Jews are just stupid. No, they're just so brilliant. They're demonically intelligent, and they can control the world with their entire and their collaboration. The Jews just control everything. Like no one would ever give a thought to maybe Jews do well in chess, not because it's rigged. The Jews like chess for whatever reason, and people who are Asians do really well in engineering, and just they make great engineers. And maybe just there are a bunch of Jewish people who just make great movies, and people don't go to Spielberg films because Spielberg is Jewish. They just, just love Jaws and all the other films that he's produced. People don't do that with the Jew. The Jews are that all is Christianity. Outside of Christianity, you wouldn't find that. And that caricature of the Jew that controls the world. Shakespeare never met a Jew in his life because the Jews had been expelled from England when Shakespeare was alive in the 16th and early 17th century. But he produced The Merchant of Venice in 1599, wrote it about a Jew with a very important Jewish character that was not flattering. Where did he get that from? Not from meeting Jews, from just how Jews are portrayed. That's thoroughly Christian. It's thoroughly the God. The Jews are just trying to stop Jesus at every corner, at every turn, and they're doing it for no good reason. They're just nasty. It's not like they misunderstand. They know the truth but reject Christ anyway. They're bribing Roman soldiers. They're just the worst. The Roman centurion, in contrast, is going that Jesus really is the Son of God. That's how the book of Mark ends. So that's where anti-Semitism emerges from. It emerges from storytelling. That's how bigotry is created. People become bigots or hate whatever group not because they're told dogmatically this group is bad. The reason why people are bigoted is because they're told stories about a certain group, and then they are not told similar stories about a different group, and those stories are that's the way, the vehicle with which the hatred and caricature of any group is created. Well, that's what the Gospels do at every turn. The Jews are the ones who are the enemies of Christ, plotting against him.
Yeah, that's a good point that I've never thought of, as the Gospels portray the Jews as controlling Rome, right?
Sure.
On the decision to crucify Jesus, and that's a good parallel to the whole conspiracy theories, right? And
Well, for
maybe
sure.
that's the original model.
Pontius Pilate is fighting he's saying he's innocent. In fact, Jesus makes it very clear to Pontius Pilate that, look, your sin is not even important. It was, the Jews screaming, take him away. And Jesus says to Pontius Pilate, look, your sin you- is not there. It's the Jews. It's the one that gave me over to you. It's their sin that's great. I mean, it's explicitly Pontius Pilate is calling for the exoneration of Jesus. He washes his hands of this, as I
Yeah.
see nothing guilty in him, and the Jews are screaming, crucify him. And Pontius Pilate is told directly by Jesus, we're told. It's a story that we only find in John's passion narrative, where Jesus actually says, you didn't do anything wrong. It's the ones that gave me over to you, to their sin. It's very, very clear. The Jews, Paul says this in First Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 14 through 16. He says, and even as they have of the Jews who both killed the Lord Jesus Christ and their own prophets, are contrary to mankind, they're the enemy of everything. And one other point, the New Testament is very pro-Roman, very pro-Roman. People really don't realize how pro-Roman it is, but the Romans are off the hook completely for this. And Paul really holds of the empire. In Romans chapter 13, Paul encourages people to be loyal to the empire, not because it's practical, it's pragmatic, you don't want to get killed. No, Paul's argument is that God put the Roman Empire in place. That's part of his plan. He wants them there. And therefore, you should be dutiful and lawful and respectful. People don't realize how pro-Roman the New Testament is and how viciously anti-Semitic it is. The Romans can't do anything wrong. They make mistakes, but they don't know any better. The Jews are behind every evil thing in the world.
And it's without any kind of rationale behind it. Like, why would they need to portray Jews like that? Like, how does that benefit them?
Gosh, who doesn't need a scapegoat? Who doesn't need a group to blame all the problems on, right? Moreover, if you say nice things about the Roman Empire, then it's more likely that you're not going to be persecuted. It's more likely that you're going to find favor with the empire. And moreover, this is the motherlode of it all. There's a fundamental problem that Christians have to deal with, not just today, but throughout its history. And it's the question that pastors and professors of New Testament share with me. That's one of the most frequently asked questions that Christians pose. And then they ask, why don't the Jews believe in Christ? And I have a lot of friends who are pastors, who are New Testament. I know them. Okay? I ask them, like, what questions come up a lot? That's one of them. Like, why don't the Jews believe this? You have to understand, the church is claiming that the truth and proof of Christianity can be demonstrated from the Old Testament. It's right there. And it says that in the New Testament. If you would have believed in Moses, you would have believed in me, because he wrote about me in John 5:46, 2 Timothy 3:16, Luke 24:44. It's really all over the place. So the big question, really, like, the truth of Christianity, its veracity can be demonstrated from the Hebrew Bible, and that's the foundation of truth. Well, what do the Jews say about you? Like, what do the Jews say about your religion? Oh, the Jews have believe that Jesus is not the Messiah. Really, the Jews have a reputation of being fairly smart. Like, Why don't they believe in it? They're the only ones who can read the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, in its original language. No one else reads Hebrew. Like, only the Jews read it. They were expecting the Messiah. More importantly, they were in the land of Israel when this whole thing went down, when these putative events actually went down. Like, why weren't they impressed? This is not like saying the Chinese don't believe in Jesus. It doesn't make a difference what the Chinese think. They don't have a concept of the Messiah. They never did. They weren't there. The Jews were there. And the Jews have a reputation for their intelligence. Like, it's their Bible, it's their hope, it's their dream, it's their core tenets. Therefore, how do you explain away why Jews don't believe this? Why Jews don't find this persuasive? Worse, they find it grotesque. You have to explain that. Well, you could say to your parishioners, the church father could have said to their students, well, the Jews don't believe in Jesus. I'll tell you why. Because they look at the Bible and they view it differently. You know what that would do? People go, why do they view it differently? Holy smokes, So they can't do that because that's completely discredits it. Like the Jews, like, why don't they? This is what is bothersome. So what you have to do is you have to say there's some supernatural reason why the Jews don't believe this, because they're the ones that are supposed to believe this. So you'd have to say that the Jews, there's some conspiracy. The Jews are just enemies. They deliberately don't do it. Sometimes Paul will say in Romans that the Jews were deliberately blinded, so they couldn't know the truth, and to trigger jealousy among the Jews, and it was passed on to the Gentiles for a period of time. Or the Jews are just the enemies of Christ, as I mentioned in John chapter 8. You've got to explain away why it is the hideous nature of the Jew to deny Christ. And that's what you find, like the story of the Good Samaritan. It's a nightmare of a story. It's about how the Jews behave so badly, but yet the Samaritan, who's not Jewish, is so kind and thoughtful. That's the whole story. The whole story is just a nightmare for Jews. So that's why the Jews have to be characterized that way. It's a polemic. It's an explanation of why don't the Jews believe in Jesus? Oh, they're evil. They're enemies of God. I see. Okay, now I understand. And then you've got it. You've got your scapegoat. The Jews are
Mhm.
enemies of God, and don't look to them for true. No, they're evil.
Yeah, and the explanation doesn't really go deeper than that. It's just that they're just enemies just for the sake of being enemies. That's the explanation.
Ask a Christian. I mean, no one has to take my word for it. Just ask a Christian, why don't the Jews believe in Jesus? Now, I'm not saying ask a liberal Christian. Right? Like, whatever your politics, I don't mean an Episcopalian who takes his Christianity very lightly. I'm not talking about a liberal Presbyterian. I don't mean them. Okay. I'm talking about a fundamentalist Christian, core, hardcore. Ask them, why don't they just believe if this is so persuasive? Well, what are they going to tell you? I'll tell you this: the Jews were blinded. Well, today anti-Semitism is not socially acceptable. You can't. People can't express. They can, but they become socially outcast. It's just not acceptable to be anti-Semitic today socially. You can't say things about. So they got to come up with some other thing, like the Jews are blinded, they can't see, they turn their back on Christ, whatever it is. You got to come up with an explanation, but that explanation cannot include that they thought it through, they examined the evidence that we advanced, and they drew a different conclusion. No way. Because then why? They're like really smart, and it's their Bible, and it's their Messiah. Like, they ought to know. So that's why the anti-Semitism. If you just say the Jews are just evil, and let me make this clear, all the church fathers hated Jews. It wasn't like they weren't like Pat Buchanan, that was like he was not crazy about Jews, but he wasn't. These people hated Jews. All of them did. They all said the most horrible. Don't take my word for it. Like, you can Google. All you have to do is this: Google, what did the church fathers say about the Jews? Just do that. Like, do that. Okay. It's like, okay, you're gonna see stuff about people, church fathers, and you're gonna go, holy smokes, this is stuff that would come out of the Third Reich. These are the most. They wrote books about the Jews. There were none of them favorable. The reformers, Luther, he was a crazy a grotesque
Mhm.
anti-Semite. Bucer, Calvin, they all hated us. This was normative. They all hated it. I mean, that's why when I see Christian anti-Semitism, I go, of course you're an anti-Semite. I was on the streets. There's a film on my YouTube channel of me encountering a Christian on the streets of Jerusalem, and he said we had a conversation. Very quickly said that he looked at my kippah. He saw I'm Jewish. I said, "Yeah, you Jews killed him." He just said it right to my face in Jerusalem, and I said, "I don't blame you. I don't blame you for saying that, because a natural reading of the Christian Bible would be consistent with these grotesque ideas that the Jews today killed Jesus." And in fact, it says that. He didn't even know the verse. I told him it says it in Matthew 27:25, where the Jews say, this is all nonsense. They never said any of this stuff. But we are told that the Jews said, we take his crucifixion upon ourselves and our children forever. Always, for all generations. In the Christian Bible, the Jews are uniquely culpable for killing God, for killing Christ. Always. We committed deicide. Absolutely. I mean, Augustine's his most important work, I think, his City of God, explains, the horrific conditions of the Jews is because they killed Christ. They all believe that, every one of them.
Um, Now, do you think that's the origins of Gnosticism? Is with anti-Semitism, or maybe not quite?
Gnosticism? No. So Christian Gnosticism was a belief that the Jewish God was really an inferior and actually a bad figure. So Gnosticism had just so many iterations. It's so highly variegated. The only what Gnostic um, believers had in common is they saw a dualistic world where a greater God and lower gods, and the God of this world was bad. And we need to escape this world. And how do you get off this planet created by a malevolent deity? Well, you need knowledge, special knowledge. That's what Paul is always talking about. He has special knowledge that can rescue you, because it's a grand mystery, Ephesians 3:3. So the Gnostic Christians that emerged big in the 2nd century. So there were Gnostics before this, long before this, but Gnostic Christianity, which was huge, said that the God of the Jews, the God of the Old Testament, is the creator of this world, and he's a malevolent God. Whereas the God of Christ, the God of Jesus and Jesus never died. It only appeared that he died. They saw him as not a material being, and it was just an appearance that he was human or that he died. He didn't really die. It just seemed that way. So Gnostic Christians were anti-Jewish, not in a conventional sense, as we would say anti-Jewish today. Of course, their views would have inflamed anti-Semitism, certainly, but their view was theologically more amped up, and that is that this whole world was created by the God of the Jews. The Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, was not a holy book at all, because it was inspired by a malevolent God, the God of the Jews, and Christ was here not to die for anyone's sins, but to impart gnosis, knowledge, so that you can escape this world of the Jews. And Jesus was never even crucified. It appeared, it appeared that he died, but he could possibly die because he was completely a spirit. So that's what Gnostic Christianity was right at home with anti-Jewish views. But Gnostic Christianity held something that the Orthodox didn't, and that is that the God of the Old Testament is a bad God. So other Christian groups, no matter which it was, whether it was modalistic, Sabellianist type groups or Marcionites, didn't hold quite the same idea. They felt that the God of the Jews were inferior, but it's similar. It's in the same
Mhm.
kind of. There are many, many similarities. These were huge movements. The way we know again about them is because the church fathers wrote about them. There were church fathers who devoted their lives to just fighting them. They were opposed to anyone who was not, within their view, Orthodox. So you have people in the 2nd century, 4th, 5th century so that's how we know about all these groups. So Gnostic Christianity was perfectly at home with anti-Semitism because they thought the Jewish God was an evil God. That's really pressing it.
Yeah. And then instead of kind of focusing on Jews, it's the whole world because the Jewish God is real, but the world is terrible. So they're not really focused so much on anti-Semitism, but it's kind of anti everything, all creation. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I mean, when Paul said that Satan is the Lord of this world, what does that mean? It's all there. This is one grotesque mosh pit. It's all just, it's one, and again, it all goes back to the idolatry. The idolatry really always is that the transcendent God who created everything, he's good, but we're just grotesque beings in a grotesque body, and we need to escape this grotesque world. And it's understandable. There was no justice to them. Like, I've gone to the doctor with a bad back, with whatever, right? And the doctor was able to give me the proper injection. The pain went away and the infection went away. And I'd ask the doctor, like, what did they do 100 years ago? And the doctor, I remember many times my doctor would say, 100 years ago, people just died or were miserably in pain constantly. I went, wow, I'm happy I'm here now. That the ancient world was just full of misery and inexplicable misery. It was not like someone did something stupid and got killed. People just died for no apparent reason. They didn't know what microbiology was. So to them, there were just good and evil forces on this world. And inexplicably, the gods were angry and a volcano came and killed everybody. And that's what people got in trouble if they didn't bring sacrifices to the great state gods. It made them angry. Yeah.
Yeah. And what would you say about, so I've heard that Gnosticism developed in part because of failed messianic prophecy with Christianity, that, all of these things will come to pass before this generation passes away, right? Do you Would you say that the seemingly failed messianic prophecies of Christianity, um, do you see theological implications in that, or do you see maybe that's where Gnosticism came from?
Gnosticism was around long before the gospel. So the passages you're referring to are in Mark chapter 9, Mark chapter 13. We find in the other gospels that this generation will not pass away before these things occur. There are many of you standing here who will not taste of death until you see everything happen in this great power. Of course, those things failed. They didn't occur. They didn't take place. So Christians had to deal with these questions. Some of them thought that maybe they were happening in some mysterious way at the time, which we can't see. There are people to this day who believe that. There are people who just wanted to ignore that, and that was more John. John tried to solve that because you don't have that kind of stuff in John. Not only that, in John, you don't have the world changing, but really the whole salvation in God's kingdom is in heaven, not here, right? I mean, John has just moved the target around. But it's true that those supposed prophecies of Jesus never occurred. I don't think they led to Gnosticism. I think they led to the idea of a second coming that was in the distant future. And I think that's what would trigger John. John has to explain why didn't why wasn't the world transformed. So John is now saying in his conversation in John 3 with Nicodemus that in fact all the benefits are in heaven, and unless you're born again, born from above, you can't be saved. So for John, it's no longer a salvation of this world. And so what they do is they sort of move the target. So yeah, the arrow missed the target. So what you do is just move the target and just change it. And that's what John did, and that's what the church did. And I think that's why John was always everyone's favorite gospel, because John solved this by saying there's a whole different target. It's not a salvation on this world, but really it's a heavenly salvation. It's all spiritualized. Moreover, remember when John is written? The book of John is written in the late first century, in the 90s. That means everyone's dead, right? Everybody's gone. By then, there's no one alive. That's why the church had to make up the idea that John lived to some age of 100 years old. I'm not saying it's impossible that someone in the first century couldn't live to 100. It just was extremely unlikely. What they knew John was late. So they wanted John to be written by John, the son of Zebedee, a disciple of Jesus, even though there's nothing in the text that says that. So they said, oh, John somehow just survived everything and just lived to a very, very old age. But whoever wrote the book of John realized that the solution the synoptic gospels were employing wasn't working, and that the target had to change. So that's how the church dealt with it, that the whole salvation had nothing to do with this world and was all spiritual, and you don't get it. If you watch carefully this conversation in John, that's why Nicodemus doesn't exist before John. Like, where is this Nicodemus character? He's an invented character. He's not real. That's why he's only in John, right? And only in John does Nicodemus assist Joseph of Arimathea to bury. Where did he come from? He comes from John's world, the Joannian world. And that is, he was a Jew, a rabbi who came to believe in Jesus. And Jesus just excoriates him in chapter 3. Like, you don't know anything. You don't get any of it. Unless you are born again, you can't be saved. And there's a double entendre there. The whole thing is nonsensical because the double entendre, unless you're born again, Nicodemus doesn't get what he's talking about, like born again. So in Greek, born again can either be like born a second time or born from above. So they'd have to be talking Greek in order for this conversation to make sense. Nicodemus doesn't get it, and Jesus just roasting him. But that's the key. It's born from above. It's a spiritual, heavenly salvation. It's not of this world. It's a borrowing from Augustine. It's the city of God, not here.
Got it. And so this is like, the second coming, obviously, that has nothing to do with Judaism, I'd imagine. There's probably no parallel that they're getting, anything like that. But like apocalypticism, does that have any foundation in Jewish thought, or is that's just
Yes. Yeah. An apocalyptic eschatology just means a a sudden revelation at the end. That's really what it means. That's all it means. So how is this thing going to go down? Like, how is the end, the final redemption of the world, going to go down? How is it going to happen? Right? So imagine if you lived in the ancient world, you knew that the Messiah can come. You hoped the Messiah would come through. But imagine if you're in the first century, the Roman Empire was at the height of its power. And there was nothing in human history like the Roman Empire. Nothing. They weren't going anywhere. So you believed in a eschatology, means the end of time, just a Greek word eschaton, the end. Well, how is it going to happen? So, like, we're living in a time now where the Jews actually have an independent state in the land of Israel, and they return in a very simple a way where you can explain it. Just whatever happened, but the Jews somehow made it back to the land of Israel and reestablished their state by decolonizing it, right? Undoing what had started with Pompeii. So, but then they couldn't imagine that. So they just imagined in the ancient world there was an end. And if it was a sudden pow, like God is here, fine. Every Jews looked at the text and knew these are the things that must occur when the Messiah comes. No second coming. Second comings are the sign, is the red flag of a false religion. Every false Messiah, every one of them had to claim a second coming because they all died. Well, if they die, well, where is the promise? It's going to happen the second time. So if you hear second coming, run. I mean, 'cause that means it's a false religion. There's nothing like that in the Hebrew Bible, but you have to invent it because it just didn't occur. It just didn't transpire. But the idea of an apocalyptic eschatology of just an explosive event where suddenly, okay, we're here, that would mean in the first century that the Roman Empire would have to fall because the whole key of the Messianic age is the Messiah is now king, right? That's the whole point. And he's the great teacher, and everyone listens to him. Well, how would that happen when you have all these emperors who have standing armies that are more powerful than the world has ever known? There was nothing like it. That means it would have to be God would just have to destroy the empire. That's what got you killed. That's what got you. I want to change that. That's what got you crucified. That's what would make the empire very concerned about you, and they wanted to make an example of it. Why would they go through crucifixion? It's a horrible way to kill someone, but it's also very expensive. It's a lot easier to chop someone's head off. They wanted to make an example of you because you were, in their view, encouraging insurrection against the empire. That was the worst thing you can do. So that made an example out of you. There's no doubt Jews always believed that the coming of the Messiah can happen at any time. And if Jews are living in a predicament like the empire first century, so the only way it could happen then was something just explosive, like an apocalypse, just a massive revelation, lowercase r, where suddenly it all became known. Okay. Yeah.
So that doesn't does that idea exist within Jewish thought? Like after is there an end of the world in Judaism, and what does it look like?
It's the end of an epic that it looks exactly like a nation returning back to its land with a king from the Davidic house who all nations will listen to, and all the peoples of the world will recognize him as a person who speaks in the name of God, and he will rebuke the nations, and they'll listen to him immediately. They'll take their swords and turn them into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. War will come to an end because, in the view of the Hebrew Bible, the underpinning of war is really a discord over belief and faith. And therefore, if people were of the same accord and all believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they would immediately stop fighting with each other. So he doesn't have to do any miracles at all. There's no mention anywhere in the Hebrew Bible that he is going to perform a miracle. Doesn't mean he won't. It's just really unimportant to the Hebrew Bible. The key is that he rebukes the nations, the Jews return back to their land. Eventually they build a temple. All the nations recognize the Jewish faith as the only true faith. And then it's followed by the resurrection of the dead for the faithful. That, but again, so if you're living in an empire under the Roman Empire, so if you thought the Messiah can come imminently, you had to believe that there was an apocalyptic eschatology where just God's power would come and just destroy the enemies of Israel. If you live in a time like today, and you're a religious Jew or a believer in the Jewish faith, you would say that nations come up against Jerusalem. And as it turns out, like there's a lot of nations that just want to destroy us for some reason. And then they'll be defeated, which will be followed by the coming of the Messiah. It's
Yeah.
the end game. Just the point is, the end game has to be just very simple. Not like everyone's killed or anything like that. The end game is everyone worships one God, and Jerusalem will be the center of the world. Out of that will come forth all the Torah, and there'll be a complete ingathering, the building of a temple. That's it. That's the end game. How you get there, that's complete chaos.
So the world essentially keeps going forever.
Yes, very much so. And this must occur by the year 6000. We're now in the year 5783, right? From Adam. So that must happen before the year 6000. That's all, at some point. And then the world keeps going on. That's correct. People still have babies, getting married, having children. They're just worshiping one God. There's no longer discord between nations. Everyone worships one true God, and peace will seize the world, and war will be something of the past, and everyone will worship the one God of Israel. That's it.
Yeah. So it's resurrection of the faithful. So
Yeah.
if you're not faithful, is it annihilation?
Yeah. That means if a person, it depends how unfaithful you are. Daniel 12, verse 2 tells us about the resurrection. So, one caveat for your viewers: the resurrection is mentioned very rarely in the Hebrew Bible, or it should be said more generally, the afterlife is mentioned very rarely, and it's never a threat. This is very important. In the Hebrew Bible, you never threaten about anything that happens after you die, ever. Why? Because it's unfalsifiable. You can't verify it. Like, you don't know what happens after you die, right? But if you're God, like if you're God, right? If you were God, you can make it stop raining, right? You can that if you're not God, you don't want to predict that because you can control the weather. So I just want to explain how rare this is. But in
Mhm.
Daniel 12:2, it tells us that there are many who lie in the earth who will rise for everlasting life. And then there are the wicked who will arise for a momentary time for everlasting contempt, which means people will just see them and revile them. The resurrection, the physical resurrection, is for all those who are faithful. I mean, that's why the bones are not destroyed. They last thousands of years. Why? And they don't burn because they're made of calcium. They have so much calcium in them. It's from the bones that there's a resurrection for the faithful, physical resurrection, and that follows.
Got it. So if you're cremated, there's no resurrection for you?
If a person is cremated, a person, look, I'm just telling you as a rabbi, don't get cremated because it destroys the bones. And the fires that are used in cremation actually can't destroy the bones, and they have to grind it down. That's something they don't tell you that, but they actually grind the what is left of the bones down to what they tell you is ashes. But it is the bones that are preserved for the resurrection. It's not just a cute way that some relic of a body survives. The bones survive. We dig up bones that are thousands of years old. It's from that that the body is reconstituted. If a person willingly is cremated, so then that person is saying, I don't want anything to do with that, or I don't believe in that. So that person will not resurrect anyway. If a person accidentally is burnt, their bones will survive because calcium, the 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 point at which calcium can burn is so hot that people just don't produce ovens that hot. So, if someone says, "I just don't want any part of the God of Israel," so why wouldn't they get cremated? And that person has no part in the resurrection.
Got it. All right. And yeah, so it's a bodily resurrection, and then I mean it's just business as usual for the most part, except everybody is essentially Jewish. There's no like
Oh, no, no. No, very much not that. Judaism is a universal religion. I don't want to offend anyone. It's really the only universal religion. That means you don't have to be a Jew in order to have a relationship with God. any person who accepts there are 7 Noahide laws, and any person, every human being is created in the image of God. Jews don't have a special ticket to heaven at all. Jews have a responsibility to be a light to the nations, but the righteous of all the nations have a place in the world to come. There are 7 principles, the biblical principles, that a person must accept and do it not because they think it's right, not to steal, not to kill, but because God commanded me to be honest in business. And if a person is faithful to the God of Israel, they don't have to join the Jewish nation to do this. They have eternal life. That's why Jews don't try to convert anyone. That's why Judaism is so different in this way, especially from monotheism. Monotheisms are typically intolerant because they're monotheism, so they're not eclectic. I don't want to use the word intolerant. They're just not eclectic. Pagan religions are usually fairly eclectic because so many gods, just add another one. What's the difference? But Judaism teaches that the righteous of all the peoples of the world have a place in the world to come. Jews totally don't have a monopoly on this at all. And the way Jews influences the world is by our light, not by any other way. And in a way, Christianity sought to replace that Jesus is the light rather than the Jews. You see, so it's a real replacement theology. And the Jews are all wrong, and they just bring darkness to the world. So that's the message of Judaism. You don't have to convert. That's why we don't try to convert anyone. You can. We'll try to talk you out of it. But why don't we try to convert people? Because you don't need to convert to Judaism to be right by God. So there's no imperative to convert. Every human being is binary in that we're both a physical body, which is no different than your dog or your horse. I mean, when you see a dog, I don't know if you have a dog, but he's pretty easy to figure out, and it's easy to relate to him. He wants to be safe, warm, fed. He wants to have babies. That's pretty. So we're all that, but we have a soul. That's the consciousness of the human being that no other creature has. That self-awareness, the knowledge that we're going to die. No other animal knows that. That we can believe in God. No animal in the world could ever believed in God, ever. Only human beings. So we have 2 things, and that's where the tension is. The tension is between our soul, our consciousness, which can never be destroyed unless we do it to ourselves. But our soul is a divine spark. We're Bluetooth connected to God. That's why that's why more than 90% of this planet is occupied by people who believe in God. It's not that easy to find people who don't believe in God today in Europe, but it's people generally believe in God. It's just a default. It's just it's an intuition that there's a God. A person may come to go, I don't want to believe in God for sure, but that's the tension. So, and then we have physical desires, and then we're creating the image of God, so we know that there's good and evil in the world. Look, let me just say this. The people who are atheists are constantly finding themselves and trying to address the question of good and evil. Is there such a thing in a completely materialistic model? Right now, whether they have if they have in a satisfying way addressed that question or not, they know it's a very important question. Because if we are all walking protoplasm, if it's just carbon and there is no higher power, nothing, then there is no empirical evil in the world. And people empirically know that it's just really evil when they kill them. But if in the animal world, lions routinely kill cubs sired by another male and rape the mother, and we don't consider that bad. So all I'm saying is everyone gets that this is a very big issue. Everyone gets that. How do you explain the conscious mind? That's something that scientists admit, to their credit, that this is a problem that's not been solved yet. And the cosmological question, where did it start? I understand a moment after it started, but the expansion, but where did it come from? Judaism seeks to explain those two issues, that God is the beginning. He's created everything from nothing, and he is our consciousness, which means we're created in his image. Every person is, not just Jews. Everybody is created in the image of God. And we're called upon to recognize that, to find that spiritual spark inside of us, although our physical body is saying, do something else. So that's very much the core essence of Judaism, that it is having children is a good thing. Just make sure you have children with your own wife, not somebody else's wife. So Judaism is when Judaism hears ideas that Paul advances, where Paul praises celibacy in Romans chapter 7, we're going, oh God, that's terrible. Because you're supposed to be fruitful and multiply with a woman that you've devoted your life to, right? So it's a good thing. The physical world is a good thing, but just, hone it properly, enjoy, eat, just make sure it's food that you didn't steal, that you've earned the money properly. Thank God for it. That's all. Raising the physical into the spiritual realm. That's all what Judaism is.
Gotcha. All right. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
So it was my
And
pleasure.
yeah, it was a real pleasure. Very educational.
All right. Thank you so
Yep.
much, Elliot.
Yep. Thank you. Have a great rest of the day here.